The night was endless, the rain unceasing. 200 enemies climbed the hill, and one man refused to fall. This is the story of Tenzin Dorjee, the last soldier who stood when everyone else was gone. December 14th, 1941, Solukhumbu, eastern Nepal. The first snow of winter blanketed the valley like white ash. The wind from the Himalayas roared down the slopes, scattering prayer flags and driving smoke from the yak dung fires into the gray sky. The air burned with cold, dry enough to slice the lungs. Down in the village, men in wool coats huddled near the monastery gate, whispering about the war spreading across Asia. Tenzin Dorjee adjusted the strap of his worn satchel as he climbed the frozen path toward the British recruiting tent. He was small, barely 5 feet tall, with the wiry strength of a mountain climber and the quiet gaze of someone who'd spent his life watching storms crawl across peaks. The red banner of the Gurkhas flapped above the tent. To him, it looked less like a flag and more like a challenge. Inside, a British sergeant sat behind a folding table, boots muddy, eyes weary. He measured every volunteer with the same dull routine. Height, age, name. When Tenzin's turn came, the man frowned at the tape. 4'11", he said flatly. Too short. Next, Tenzin didn't move. Sir, he said quietly, I can climb where others fall. The Japanese fight in the mountains, yes? The sergeant looked up, mildly amused. And you think height wins wars? No, sir, Tenzin replied, steady and calm. But courage does. A brief silence. The officer's expression softened. You Sherpas never stop pushing, do you? He scribbled something on a paper and waved him off. Come back when the Empire needs climbers more than soldiers. That evening, snow fell harder. Inside their stone hut, Tenzin's father, Dorjee Sherpa, mended a torn rope harness by the fire. Without looking up, he said, They turned you away. Tenzin nodded. They said I was too small. His father grunted. A small man can still carry a heavy promise. Remember that outside, the wind howled through the valley like a beast searching for prey. Tenzin stared at the curved kukri hanging on the wall, his father's old blade, the symbol of duty. He whispered, One day they'll call, and when they do, I'll be ready. The fire crackled, the steel caught the light, and for a brief second, the reflection of the flame looked like a battlefield waiting for him. The rain came down in sheets, turning the parade ground into a swamp of red mud. Recruits stood in straight lines, their uniforms soaked, faces streaked with dirt. Among them was Tenzin Dorjee, finally accepted after Britain lowered its height requirement. The Empire was desperate now. Every man who could hold a rifle was needed. Left! Right! Left! Shouted a British corporal, his voice cutting through the storm. Boots splashed in unison. The rhythm was relentless. The Gurkhas were being forged into steel. Training was merciless. They ran 20 kilometers before dawn, climbed ropes until their hands bled, learned to fight with bayonets and kukris. Tenzin's small frame struggled at first. The rifle felt heavy, the pack unbearable. Yet each night, while others collapsed on their bunks, he stayed awake, cleaning his Lee Enfield rifle under the dim oil lamp. Every scratch, every click of the bolt became familiar. By the third month, he could strip and reassemble the rifle blindfolded. Sergeant Major Collins, a battle-hardened veteran from North Africa, noticed. You again, Collins said one evening, leaning against the tent post. 4'11", but tougher than half the men here. What keeps you going, lad? Tenzin straightened. A promise, sir. To stand when others fall, Collins studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Keep that promise, and the world will remember your name. The weeks blurred together. Drills, mud, sweat, rain. They practiced ambushes in the jungle, hand signals, silent movement. Tenzin learned to listen to the forest, to the hiss of rain, the crack of twigs, the faint echo of boots. Fear slowly turned into instinct. At night, he wrote letters he could never send. Father, one began, they've given me a rifle, but what they really teach here is to stop being afraid of dying. By late 1943, the 10th Gurkha Rifles were declared combat ready. Rumors spread that Japanese forces were pushing west through Burma. Orders came swiftly. Prepare to move toward the Irrawaddy front. On the eve of departure, Tenzin opened his kit. Inside lay the kukri his father had given him, the blade now polished bright. He whispered, "You said it's for duty, father." Tomorrow duty begins? The jungle was alive, not with birds or insects, but with the slow, nervous breathing of men who knew the enemy was close. The air was thick and wet, every leaf glistening with rain. Mud swallowed their boots with each step. Tenzin Dorjee crouched behind a fallen log, his Lee Enfield pressed tight against his shoulder. Around him, the rest of C Company moved silently through the undergrowth. The Gurkhas were scouting ahead for the British 14th Army, tasked with cutting off Japanese supply lines along the Irrawaddy. For days they had marched through leech-filled swamps, sleeping little, eating less. Every sound carried weight. A snapped twig could mean death. "Stop!" whispered Sergeant Collins, raising his hand. Ahead through the ferns, a faint glint of metal, the curved bayonet of a Japanese sentry. Collins signaled. 2 Gurkhas flanked left, blades drawn. In seconds, the silence was broken by a muffled cry and the dull thud of a kukri finding its mark. The sentry fell without a shot. Tenzin exhaled slowly. His hands trembled, but his eyes stayed steady. Collins looked back and nodded. Good composure for a rookie. By afternoon, the monsoon rain returned. The jungle turned to a river of mud, their uniforms soaked, weapons slippery. Then it happened. A single rifle crack, sharp and close. A Gurkha in front collapsed, blood splattering his khaki sleeve. "Contact front!" Collins shouted. The jungle erupted. Bullets sliced leaves. Grenades exploded in wet soil. Tenzin dove for cover, heart pounding like a drum. For a brief second, he froze. Training warred with instinct. Then he remembered Collins' words. Stand when others fall. He lifted his rifle, found the muzzle flash through the foliage, and fired. The recoil slammed into his shoulder. The shape vanished behind a bush. Another burst, another shout. When the gunfire faded, 3 Japanese soldiers lay dead. 2 Gurkhas were wounded. The rain washed blood into the mud until both became the same color. That night, as they regrouped under a tarpaulin, Collins clapped Tenzin on the shoulder. "You did well today, lad. You're one of us now." Tenzin looked into the dark jungle where the fight had happened. His fingers tightened on the kukri at his belt. He wasn't afraid anymore, just aware that fear would always be there, waiting, and that a soldier's duty was to walk straight into it. The road to Imphal was nothing more than a strip of mud carved between jungle and mountain. Convoys of trucks crawled forward, their engines groaning, tires half buried in red clay. Above them, rain clouds pressed low and heavy. Tenzin Dorjee sat on the back of a supply truck, the barrel of his rifle resting on his knee. Around him, men smoked in silence. The Gurkhas of the 10th Rifles had been ordered to reinforce the eastern flank of the British 14th Army. Rumors spread that the Japanese 15th Division had crossed the border. No one said it aloud, but every man knew this would not be a patrol, it would be survival. They reached Tamu by dusk. The outpost smelled of oil, gun grease, and fear. Artillery boomed in the distance, faint but steady, like thunder with purpose. Sergeant Collins gathered his men under a dripping tarpaulin. "Listen up. The Japs are pushing toward Imphal. Our job's simple. Hold the road. If they take it, they roll straight into India." He pointed at the jungle ahead. "They'll come through there, fast, quiet, and mean. Don't underestimate them. You hear Japanese shouting, you shoot first." That night, Tenzin shared a trench with Corporal Bahadur, a veteran from the Arakan campaign. Bahadur handed him a tin of cold beans and said, "First time on the line?" Tenzin nodded. "Then remember this," Bahadur said, tapping his kukri. "The jungle listens. If you panic, it will swallow you." Rain started again, drumming on their helmets. Tenzin wiped the mud from his rifle and looked toward the dark tree line. Somewhere beyond it, men were already dying. He thought of home, of the frozen ridges of Solu Khumbu, the firelight in his father's hut. The world there felt impossibly far. The kukri at his belt was warm against his hip, the metal faintly humming like a heartbeat. As dawn crept in, The first artillery shells whistled overhead. The campaign for Imphal had begun. The rain returned before midnight, heavy and cold, drumming endlessly on steel helmets and muddy ground. The Gurkhas crouched in shallow trenches, rifles propped on the parapet, eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Only the jungle moved, restless, whispering, alive. Tenzin Dorjee wiped the water from his bolt, his breath misting in the cold air. He could hear the low murmur of Corporal Bahadur praying softly beside him, his hand resting on the curved handle of his kukri. From somewhere deep in the forest came a sound, faint at first, then growing clearer. Footsteps. "Hold fire," whispered Sergeant Collins. "Wait until you see them." Seconds stretched like hours. The footsteps multiplied, dozens, maybe more, accompanied by the soft metallic clicks of rifles being readied. Then a single flare hissed into the sky, bursting white over the tree line. The jungle came alive in stark light, silhouettes in khaki and brown, the flash of bayonets, Japanese voices shouting, "Banzai!" "Contact front!" Collins roared. Gunfire erupted. The air filled with smoke, fire, and the stench of wet earth and cordite. Tenzin fired until his shoulder went numb. The muzzle flashes turned the night into a strobe of chaos. A grenade landed near the trench. He shouted a warning, grabbed it, and flung it back just before it exploded midair. The blast shook the ground. Bahadur fell beside him, clutching his side, blood seeping through his uniform. "Stay down!" Tenzin yelled, dragging him behind the sandbags. Minutes turned into an eternity of noise. Bullets snapping overhead, grenades bursting, screams mingling with thunder. Through it all, Tenzin reloaded, fired, and reloaded again. His fingers bled from the friction, but his hands never stopped. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the firing ceased. The jungle went quiet except for the hiss of rain. Tenzin lifted his head. The ground in front of their trench was littered with dark shapes. Bodies. Collins walked along the line, voice hoarse. "We held. Check your wounded." He stopped beside Bahadur's still form, pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, then looked away. Tenzin stared at the lifeless hand of his comrade, still gripping the kukri. His own pulse pounded in his ears. He understood at last what it meant to survive a night of war, to breathe when another man could not. When dawn came, the jungle was quiet again. Smoke hung low between the trees, thick and bitter. The ground was a mess of torn branches, broken helmets, and still bodies half buried in mud. Tenzin Dorjee moved carefully among them. The barrel of his rifle pointed down. His boots squelched in the waterlogged earth. He stepped over a spent cartridge, a discarded helmet, a hand that no longer moved. The rain had stopped, but the world still felt wet, soaked in blood, sweat, and silence. The medics worked without speaking, bandaging the wounded, dragging the dead into rows. A British lieutenant passed by, face gray, cigarette trembling between his lips. "Get used to it, Gurkha," he muttered. "This is how a front line smells." Tenzin didn't reply. He knelt beside Bahadur's body, covered now with a tarp, and laid the fallen man's kukri across his chest. The blade caught the first pale light of morning. "You said the jungle listens?" he whispered. "Then hear me now. I won't run from it." Sergeant Collins approached, his uniform caked with mud. "Dorjee," he said quietly, "we're pulling back a mile to regroup." "You're leading second section. Bahadur's gone. His men need someone." Tenzin rose, wiping grime from his face. "Understood, sir." They moved out at midday, boots squelching in rhythm, rifles slung low. The air was heavy with the smell of decay. Overhead, vultures circled lazily, waiting. That night, they camped near a ravine. Collins sat with Tenzin by a dying fire. "You handled yourself well," the sergeant said, staring into the coals. "But remember, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's doing your job even when you are." Tenzin nodded, his voice steady. "Then I'll keep doing it." Above them, lightning flashed across the horizon, silent and far away. The storm had passed, but another was coming, and every man there knew it. The climb to Khetar Ridge began before dawn. The rain had stopped, leaving the jungle soaked and steaming, the air thick with the smell of rot and gunpowder. Every step up the slope was a fight, boots sliding in red clay, packs heavy with ammunition and rations. Tenzin Dorjee led second section through the narrow path, his Lee Enfield slung across his chest, the kukri knocking softly against his thigh. Sergeant Collins trudged a few meters ahead, map clutched in one muddy hand. The higher they climbed, the quieter it became. Even the cicadas had gone silent, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. By midday, they reached the crest. Khetar wasn't much of a mountain, more a rise of earth choked with bamboo and ferns. But from there, you could see the Irrawaddy Valley stretching endlessly to the east. Smoke rose in the distance, marking where artillery shells had fallen the day before. Collins scanned the horizon and spoke without looking up. "This is it. We hold here. No retreat, no fallback. We keep this ridge, or the road to Imphal falls with it." The men began digging trenches, shoveling mud with helmets when tools ran short. Machine guns were set along the perimeter, ammo crates stacked behind makeshift walls of sandbags. By nightfall, the position looked less like a hill and more like a scar on the earth. As darkness settled, the jungle below glimmered with scattered fireflies. Tenzin sat in his trench, eating cold rice from a tin. Around him, men whispered in Nepali, jokes, prayers, half-remembered songs from home. He took out Bahadur's kukri, its blade still stained faintly at the edge. The sound of steel sliding from the scabbard was quiet but heavy. Somewhere in the dark, a single gunshot echoed. Distant, then gone. The men froze for a heartbeat, eyes turning toward the trees. Collins' voice came low and steady. "Stay sharp." They're watching, and just like that, the jungle became an enemy. Darkness fell fast over Khetar Ridge. The jungle swallowed the last traces of daylight, leaving only the rhythmic hum of insects and the faint rustle of leaves. In the trenches, men checked their rifles, tightened their webbing, and waited. Waiting was always the hardest part. Tenzin Dorjee sat beside his section, the glow of a covered lantern casting dull light across mud-streaked faces. Collins moved along the line, whispering orders. 2 men per post. Keep your ears open. No smoking, no talking. His voice was low but firm, the kind of calm that comes from years of knowing what comes next. It began with silence, then a single crack, the dry snap of a branch somewhere down the slope. A moment later, a flare arced into the sky. The world turned white. "Positions!" Collins shouted. The ridge erupted with gunfire. Tracers cut red lines through the rain-heavy air. Japanese soldiers surged up the slope, dark figures slipping between bamboo shadows. The Gurkhas met them with steady fire, each shot deliberate, controlled. Tenzin's shoulders slammed back with every recoil. The rifle kicked, his breath came fast, hot in the cool night air. He could see the enemy now. Faces twisted with effort, bayonets flashing under the flare's dying glow. One soldier leapt into the trench, screaming. Tenzin met him head-on, swung his kukri in a clean arc. The blade found flesh. The scream stopped. All around, chaos unfolded. Grenades burst in showers of mud. Bullets tore through bamboo. Men shouted, cursed, prayed. A mortar shell landed behind their line, the shockwave throwing Tenzin to the ground. His ears rang. For a moment, the world was just light and dust. "Dorjee, get that gun up!" Collins' voice cut through the ringing. Tenzin blinked, found his rifle, and fired again, blind but steady. Every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to survive one more minute. The Japanese assault broke against their line, fell back, regrouped, and came again. It was relentless, wave after wave, until the ground became slick with mud and blood alike. By the time the last flare fizzled out, only the hiss of rain remained. The ridge was still theirs, but the silence that followed felt heavier than victory. Tenzin leaned against the trench wall, chest heaving. The kukri in his hand dripped red onto the muddy floor. Collins passed by, breathing hard, his face lit by the last embers of a flare. "Still standing?" he asked. Tenzin nodded slowly. "For now." And somewhere deep inside he understood. This night was only the beginning. The ridge hadn't been won. It was simply waiting to be taken again. The night dragged on in fragments of noise and silence. Each burst of gunfire faded into heavy breathing, each scream smothered by rain. By the early hours, the Japanese attacks had stopped. The jungle went still again. Too still. Tenzin Dorjee sat slumped in the corner of the trench, hands shaking from exhaustion. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with grime and blood that wasn't all his own. Around him, the remnants of C Company whispered in low voices, counting ammunition, bandaging wounds, checking who was left. 14 standing, someone muttered. Out of 36. Sergeant Collins moved down the line, his steps uneven. Check your weapons, reload. They'll come again at dawn. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if casualties were weather, not loss. Tenzin nodded wordlessly. He cleaned his rifle with a strip of torn fabric, the motion slow, mechanical. Beside him lay the kukri, its blade dull under the faint light. He could still feel the vibration of the last strike in his arm. The moment steel met bone, the weight of ending a life. When the sky began to pale, mist rolled in from the valley, curling around the ridge like a ghost. Collins climbed onto a mound of earth, scanning through his binoculars. The Irrawaddy shimmered in the distance, quiet, indifferent. "They're regrouping," he said softly. "We'll hold until relief comes." But everyone knew no relief was coming soon. The nearest supply line was cut 2 days ago. Their radio had gone silent hours earlier. The Gurkhas were alone on Khetar Ridge, outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of hope. Tenzin ate a handful of cold rice, more to chew than to taste. His hands moved automatically, refilling magazines, adjusting sights. The routine steadied him. "Dorjee," Collins said suddenly, crouching beside him. "If I go down, you take command of the section." "Don't argue," Tenzin looked up, eyes steady. "You're not going down, sir." Collins gave a tired grin. "That's the spirit. But promises don't stop bullets." Somewhere below, a trumpet sounded. Sharp, foreign, unmistakable. The Japanese were coming again. Collins drew his revolver, voice rising above the rustling leaves. "Positions! Hold the ridge." Tenzin chambered around, heart pounding in rhythm with the rain that had begun to fall again. As the jungle erupted once more, he thought only of one thing. If dawn must come, it will find him still standing. By midnight, the ridge was a graveyard. The dead had been pulled to one side of the trench, covered with ponchos. The wounded murmured in delirium, clutching their bandaged limbs. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of blood and cordite. Tenzin Dorjee sat awake, back against the mud wall, his rifle across his lap. He hadn't slept in 2 days. Every sound felt amplified. The drip of water, the creak of bamboo, the faint hum of insects returning to life. Around him, the surviving men dozed in brief, haunted snatches of sleep. Sergeant Collins crouched beside him, eyes hollow. "Radio's gone," he said quietly. HQ's silent. "We're cut off." Tenzin didn't answer. He'd known it already. The absence of supply drops, the static on the set, the emptiness on the horizon. "How many left?" he asked finally. 10, Collins replied. "Maybe 9 if Basnet doesn't make it." He looked toward the sky. "We hold until dawn. Maybe they'll pull back. Maybe." But they both knew the Japanese wouldn't. Khetar Ridge was a prize, a perfect vantage point over the valley. Losing it meant opening the road to Imphal. The enemy would keep coming until no one stood. Tenzin cleaned his rifle again, movement slow, automatic. His hands were cracked, his nails black with dirt. He checked the ammunition pouch. 4 magazines, 1 grenade, and the kukri on his belt. That was all. Across the trench, Basnet groaned. A medic leaned over him, shaking his head. No morphine left, no bandages, only rags. Collins muttered, "We'll bury them here. No one's coming to take them home." The words hit hard, but Tenzin said nothing. He looked out into the darkness where the jungle began. It was beautiful in a way, peaceful, deceptive. The moonlight slid through the mist like smoke. Somewhere out there, unseen, the Japanese were gathering. Collins sighed, resting his head against the trench wall. If they hit us again, we'll fight until we're dry. Tenzin nodded. His voice was quiet but steady. Then we fight until the ridge goes silent. A faint wind stirred the bamboo. The jungle whispered back, as if agreeing. The attack came before dawn. A ripple of movement in the dark, the soft click of metal, and then the world exploded. Mortars rained down on Khetar Ridge. The first shell landed near the northern trench, throwing dirt and men into the air. The second hit the machine gun nest, silencing it in an instant. Tenzin Dorjee was already on his feet, shouting orders that were lost in the roar. "Hold positions! Return fire!" He fired until the barrel smoked, until every pull of the bolt felt like lifting a mountain. The jungle below was a sea of muzzle flashes. Hundreds, maybe more. Collins was at the center of the ridge, yelling into a useless radio, blood running down his arm. "No signal! They've jammed us!" Another explosion swallowed his words. By the time the bombardment stopped, the ridge had changed shape. Craters pocked the ground. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Out of 10 men, only 4 still moved. "Fall back to the inner trench," Collins ordered. They stumbled through the mud, dragging the wounded. The Japanese were already climbing. Fast, silent, relentless. Tenzin turned, covering their retreat. His last magazine clacked empty. He threw it aside, grabbed his kukri. The blade was slick with rain and ash. Then Collins fell. A bullet caught him just below the collarbone. He looked at Tenzin, eyes sharp even as his breath fled. "You lead now," he managed. Then he was still. There was no time to mourn. The first Japanese soldier vaulted into the trench. Tenzin met him head-on, steel against steel. The kukri slashed through cloth, then bone. Another came, then another. He fought by instinct now, every motion driven by the rhythm of survival. When the dust settled, the ridge was quiet again, except for the ragged sound of his breathing. Around him lay bodies, friend and foe alike. He looked down at Collins' revolver, half buried in mud, and picked it up. 6 rounds, that was all. He whispered to the still air, "I'll hold, sir." As long as I stand below the ridge, the jungle stirred again. Voices, movement, preparation for the next wave. Tenzin wiped the blood from his eyes, reloaded the rifle, and braced for the inevitable. He was the last man on Khetar Ridge. Dawn came gray and silent, creeping through the smoke like a ghost. The jungle below shimmered with mist, but beneath it, the enemy was moving. Dozens of shapes, maybe hundreds, fanning out through the trees. Tenzin Dorjee stood alone in the trench, boots sunk in mud, rifle across his chest. His uniform hung in tatters, his face streaked with blood and soot. Every muscle ached, every breath felt borrowed. He checked his weapon. 5 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Then he looked to the sky, pale and empty, and exhaled slowly. From the valley came the sound, the deep rolling roar of men shouting, "Banzai!" It rose and broke against the ridge like a wave. Tenzin steadied his rifle, waited. The first group appeared through the fog, moving fast, bayonets raised. He fired once. The lead man fell. Twice. Another dropped. The third came too close. The rifle jammed. He slammed the bolt with his palm, cleared it, fired again. The 4th round went wide. The 5th hit its mark. Then they were on him. He dropped the rifle and drew his kukri. The curved blade flashed once, twice, cutting arcs through the smoke. He moved like a shadow, silent, precise, every strike guided by muscle memory, not thought. A bayonet grazed his arm. He didn't feel it. Another soldier lunged. Tenzin twisted, the kukri slicing deep. Blood slicked the mud, but he kept moving, kept fighting, the blade an extension of his will. When his arm grew heavy, he switched hands, swinging left-handed, eyes wide and unblinking. A grenade landed near his feet. He kicked it away. Too late. The blast threw him backward, pain tearing through his leg. He hit the trench wall, gasping. The world rang, blurred. Still, he rose. Half crawling, half limping, he reached for Colin's revolver. 6 bullets. He fired them one by one, each shot measured, each target falling. When the last round clicked empty, the ridge went silent again. He leaned against the dirt wall, bleeding, vision fading. The kukri slipped from his grasp, landing beside him in the mud. For a long time, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faint footsteps. A Japanese officer approached cautiously, pistol drawn. He looked at the lone Gurkha, slumped but still breathing, and hesitated. Tenzin met his eyes, defiant even in defeat. The officer lowered his weapon. He said something in Japanese, perhaps a word for respect, then turned away. When the British forces retook Khetar Ridge 2 days later, they found Tenzin Dorjee still alive, unconscious, his hand wrapped around his kukri as if he had never let go. The report would say one Gurkha held the ridge for 48 hours alone. But among the men who read it, the story changed into something else. Not about victory or tactics or medals, but about a man who refused to fall when everyone else had. Years later, veterans still spoke of the lone Gurkha on Khetar Ridge. The man who fought when the world fell silent. Tenzin Dorjee survived, but he never called himself a hero. He said only, "I stood because someone had to." His story remains a tribute to courage that asked for nothing in return. If this tale moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to keep these forgotten stories of bravery alive. Your support helps history breathe again, one story at a time.